All right, so we're back, and you know what that means. It's time for another deep dive, and this time we're heading straight into the heart of a debate that's been getting a lot of attention in India. We're talking about the use of Hindi, and this whole thing was really sparked by some recent comments from, well, actor and politician Pawan Kalyan.
Oh, yeah, he definitely stirred the pot with this one.
He did, and it's not just about language, right? This thing goes way deeper. It gets into all these ideas about cultural identity, national unity.
And let's be real, a little bit of political strategy is probably mixed in there too.
Oh, for sure. So, listeners, buckle up. This is going to be a fascinating deep dive.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's just jump right in. Pawan Kalyan came out and said, hey, I'm not against Hindi itself, but I don't like it when it feels like it's being forced on people. So what's your take on that?
I think it's a pretty savvy move, strategically speaking, because now he kind of comes across as this moderate voice, someone who can appeal to a wider audience. He's not totally rejecting Hindi, but he's also acknowledging those folks who feel like their own languages are being, I don't know, kind of pushed aside.
Right. So it's like he's walking this tightrope.
Exactly, and that's not easy to do, especially in a debate as, well, as charged as this one.
Totally. And this leads us to something else Pawan Kalyan brought up that I found really interesting. He pointed to the Tamil film industry and said, hey, you guys are rejecting Hindi, but then you're dubbing your movies in Hindi to make more money.
Right. It's like this paradox.
It is. So what do you make of that? It seems kind of contradictory.
It does, doesn't it? On one hand, you have the strong resistance to Hindi, but then on the other hand, the Tamil film industry sees this huge opportunity, this giant audience they can reach if they dub their films in Hindi.
Because the Hindi-speaking market is massive.
Oh yeah, huge. It's a major factor in the global film scene, so it makes business sense to tap into it.
Right. But it does kind of make you wonder, is it hypocritical? Or is it just smart business? And what do you think, listeners?
Yeah, it's not a simple question to answer, that's for sure. We could spend a whole deep dive just unpacking that one. But one thing's for sure, the Hindi-speaking audience is a force to be reckoned with. It's not something you can just ignore if you're in the film industry, especially in India.
I know, it's huge. And you know what else is interesting? A lot of the industries down in Tamil Nadu, including the film industry, rely on migrant workers. And a lot of those workers speak Hindi.
It's true. He brought that point up too. Like, he's really trying to highlight all these different angles.
Right. So you have this push to reject Hindi,
Yeah.
but then there's this reliance on Hindi-speaking workers. What does that mean? What does that do to the social fabric? Especially when there's already this tension around Hindi being used.
It's a really crucial question, and it gets to the heart of some complex power dynamics. Are these workers being valued for their skills while simultaneously being pressured to, I don't know, maybe conform linguistically? There's a lot to unpack there, for sure.
Yeah, it's like we have to think about the whole picture, right? The lived experiences of these workers, like how they manage these complex linguistic situations. And it reminds me of something else that often gets brought up in these debates. The National Education Policy, NEP 2020. It always seems to get dragged into it.
Oh, totally. And often in a way that, well, it's kind of distorted. Like, people aren't really getting the full story.
Right, like that whole idea that NEP 2020 is forcing Hindi on everyone. It's just not true.
Right. This Hindi imposition narrative, it just keeps coming back.
It's like, hello, read the policy.
I know. NEP 2020 doesn't say Hindi is mandatory at all. It actually gives students a ton of choices. They get to pick 2 Indian languages and a foreign language. It's pretty flexible.
So why does this idea of Hindi being forced on people persist? Is it just that there's so much misinformation out there? Or is it something else? Is it deliberate?
It makes you think, doesn't it? Like, who benefits from this narrative? Who's pushing it and why? Could there be some groups out there, maybe even political groups, who want to keep this idea of Hindi imposition alive?
Yeah, because if you can get people riled up, if you can tap into those anxieties people have about their language and culture being sidelined, well, that's powerful stuff.
It is. It plays right into this thing called linguistic insecurity.
Linguistic insecurity.
Yeah, it's this fear that your language and culture are being threatened. And when people feel threatened, well, they can be manipulated. And it's interesting because this whole idea of linguistic insecurity kind of goes against what Pawan Kalyan is trying to do. He's not trying to divide people. He's actually emphasizing unity and respect for all these different cultures and languages in India.
It's true. He even uses this metaphor about slicing up a cake to make his point.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. He says, look, India's not a buffet. You can't just come in and pick and choose the bits you want. It's all connected. Every language, every culture, it's all part of what makes India India. You take one piece away, and you're diminishing the whole thing.
It's a powerful image.
Yeah.
And it speaks to this idea that India is this nation that thrives on its diversity.
Mm.
Like unity and diversity. It's a concept that we hear a lot. But he's really making us think about what it actually means, you know?
Right. He's not saying everyone has to be the same. He's celebrating the fact that different languages and cultures can exist side by side.
I like that. So do you think this kind of message, this call for unity, do you think it can actually work? Especially in the world today. I mean, things feel pretty polarized right now, don't they?
It's a good question. I mean, there are definitely forces out there that benefit from keeping these tensions alive. But I also think more and more people, especially young people, are starting to understand that India's real strength lies in its diversity.
Right. So maybe, just maybe, there's hope for a more nuanced conversation about all this. A conversation where we can talk about these issues without everyone getting so fired up.
I hope so. It's a conversation that needs to happen. And honestly, I think Pawan Kalyan, even though he's caused all this controversy, he's actually helped to create a space for that dialogue to start.
Interesting point. Sometimes you need someone to come in and shake things up a little bit, right?
Mhm.
Force people to face these tough questions.
And speaking of tough questions, there's another aspect of all this we haven't really touched on yet. The economic realities. Like, how does money factor into all these decisions about language and culture?
Oh yeah, for sure. We talked about the Tamil film industry and how they're dubbing movies in Hindi to reach a wider audience, but this goes way beyond film.
Yeah, it's like economics are this invisible hand that shapes so much of our cultural landscape. It's crazy when you think about it. Like, we hear all the time about market forces, but it's easy to forget that those forces are out there influencing things like what language we speak. Right. And sometimes it can be a good thing, like creating new opportunities. TAFE, for example, all those big multinational companies that have come into India, many of them operate mostly in English, so suddenly there's this big demand for English-speaking workers.
Which means that learning English becomes really important if you want a good job.
Exactly. It can even influence what people study in school and what kind of careers they dream of having.
Right. So it's like this whole new layer of complexity. On one hand, it's great to have those opportunities, but then on the other hand, it creates this pressure. It can almost feel like you have to prioritize languages like English or Hindi just to get ahead.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And that can definitely fuel those feelings of linguistic insecurity we were talking about before. Like, what happens to your mother tongue when the languages of economic opportunity are something else?
It's a tough question. It's like
Mm.
trying to find that balance, right, between holding on to your cultural heritage and navigating this world where, well, where money talks. You know, it makes you think about something Pawan Kalyan kept emphasizing, this idea of choice. He's saying that people should be able to choose what languages they want to learn, you know, not feel forced into it.
He's all about that flexibility that's built into NEP 2020. He keeps pointing out that the policy actually encourages people to be multilingual, to learn lots of different languages, and that it respects the diversity of languages in India.
But then we have this whole other thing going on where people are shouting about Hindi imposition,
Yeah.
even though the policy doesn't mandate Hindi at all.
It's true, and it's frustrating because, well, some groups are just clinging on to that misconception. Like, they're presenting Hindi as this big threat to all these regional languages when that's just not the reality.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to pit people against each other, creating this us versus them dynamic.
Right.
Like, if you speak Hindi, you're on one side, and if you speak, I don't know, Tamil, you're on the other.
Exactly. And you know what? That kind of tactic, it's a classic way to divide and conquer. If you can get people fighting amongst themselves, well, it becomes a lot easier to control them, doesn't it?
It's cynical, but it's true. But Pawan Kalyan, he's not playing that game. He's saying, hey, we can have all these different languages and cultures, and they can all thrive together.
He's really pushing back against that divisive narrative, you know, that whole India's not a buffet analogy. It's brilliant. It really drives home the point that we're all part of this one big, complex, interconnected system. And when we try to divide ourselves along linguistic lines, well, we all lose out.
Because we lose that richness, that vibrancy that makes India so unique, right? Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the Hindi language debate,
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the key things you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the biggest thing is don't just accept things at face value. Don't take everything you hear as gospel. Look deeper, ask questions, and really think about who is saying what and why.
It's like being a detective, right?
It is. And remember, this whole language thing, it's not happening in a vacuum. It's all tied up with culture, economics, politics. They all feed into each other.
It's complicated stuff, but it's so important to understand.
Absolutely. And most importantly, don't let yourself get pulled into those divisive narratives. Let's embrace the diversity that makes India such an amazing place.
Love that. Okay, well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for being here. It's always a blast to have you on the show.
Always a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those conversations going. See you next time.